welcome. Thank you guys for joining us today. We are really excited to kick off our first webinar in our Human Trafficking Awareness series. And I mentioned earlier, but feel free to use the chat feature or the questions feature throughout the webinar if you guys have any questions about anything. I'm going to try to watch the chat and the questions as we go through this, but then I'll take some time at the very end just to make sure that we've covered everything that you guys had questions about. So let's just get started and dive right in. Before we really dive into our topic, though, I want to start by introducing our Grace executive team. John and Angie Sullivan are our founders. Dr. John serves as our president and CEO, and Angie is our vice president and CFO. The third picture is me. I'm Jenny. I'm the advocacy, communications, and marketing director for Grace, and I have been in this role since January of 2021. And lastly, we have our newest addition, Caitlin, who will be coming on board in the very near future as our administrative coordinator. Grace is active on social media. It's where we post updates on what's happening within the organization, and it's a great way to keep our supporters engaged. If you're on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, please follow us and just help us out by engaging in our post. You can scan the QR code with your cell phone to be taken to our social media links, but I am also going to put that link here in the chat. And it is going to take you to one link that will list all of our social media pages. All right, so you guys should have that popping up in your comments or in your chat section there in just a sec. All right, now let's dive into our topic. I'm going to give you just a very quick overview of Grace, and then we are going to talk about human trafficking. We'll cover several things today, and hopefully this will leave you guys with a better understanding of what human trafficking is and what we as a whole can do to prevent it. Grace is a registered 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to foster social change through strengthening families and eradicating the vulnerabilities of human trafficking and exploitation. This mission is accomplished through educational, nutritional, wellness support. It's funded through our child sponsorships and our Friends of Grace program. And you'll notice the timeline on this slide, and these are just a few of the highlights from the past 10 years that have brought us to today. Now, I want you guys to just think for a moment, and you don't have to share your answers in the chat. You can if you want to, but just think for a moment about what comes to your mind when you think of human trafficking. Maybe it's a scenario from a movie. It could be about a child being kidnapped and forced into slavery or prostitution. Maybe it's something else. But simply put, human trafficking is the business of stealing freedom for profit. It involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion in exchange for labor, services, or commercial acts. It's common for traffickers to trick, defraud, or physically force victims into providing commercial sex. Manipulation is a big part of the work of a trafficker. Victims are lied to, assaulted, threatened, manipulated into working in inhumane, illegal, or otherwise unacceptable conditions. Okay, this is one of my favorite parts of the webinar, just because I'm always really into, like, is it myth or is it fact statements just in general, so just bear with me. So I'm going to show you guys a statement, and then we'll see if it's a myth or if it's a fact. Human trafficking is always a violent crime. Myth. Traffickers often use psychological means such as tricking, defrauding, manipulating, or threatening victims. All human trafficking involves commercial sex. Myth. There are 3 types of trafficking, and we'll talk about each of those a little more in a few slides, but they include sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and domestic servitude. Only those living illegally in the United States are at risk. Myth. There are thousands of reported cases involving foreign nationals and American citizens. Human trafficking only happens in illegal industries. Myth. Human trafficking cases have been reported in industries such as restaurants, cleaning services, construction, factories, and many more. Only women and girls can be victims of human trafficking. That is a myth. It's estimated that as many as half of sex trafficking victims and survivors are male. And these statistics that I'm getting came from various sources. The U.S. State Department, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, very reputable sources. That's where most of these statistics have come from, just in case you guys are wondering. But LGBTQ boys and young men seem to be particularly vulnerable. Human trafficking involves moving, traveling, or transporting a person across state or national borders. That is a myth. Human trafficking does not require any movement. Victims can be recruited and trafficked within their hometowns. They don't even have to leave their home, honestly. Human smuggling is what involves illegal border crossings. All commercial sex is human trafficking. This is also a myth. All commercial sex involving a minor is considered human trafficking, but commercial sex involving an adult is human trafficking if it is being done against their will as a result of fraud, force, or coercion. Trafficked individuals are physically held against their will. Sometimes. Most of the time, the situation is much more complicated than that. Some lack the necessities to get out, like transportation or a place to stay. Some are afraid for their safety. Some have been so manipulated that they don't see themselves as being a victim or being under the control of someone else. Traffickers only target victims they don't know. This is a myth. Many victims have been trafficked by romantic partners, including spouses, and by family members, including parents. All right, there are 3 types of human trafficking. We touched on them very briefly in one of the previous slides. And it is worth noting that a trafficking victim's situation can fall into more than one of these categories. The first category is sex trafficking. And victims of this type of trafficking are manipulated or forced to engage in sex acts for someone else's commercial gain. And as we stated before, anyone under the age of 18 engaging in commercial sex is a victim of human trafficking. Next is forced labor. Victims of forced labor are compelled to work for little or no pay. Common forms of labor trafficking include bonded labor, forced labor, and child labor. And then the third type of human trafficking is domestic servitude. Victims of domestic servitude are forced to work in isolation and are often hidden in plain sight as nannies, housekeepers, or other domestic help. All right, this is a question that's been popping up a lot lately in the research that I've been doing, and that is, what is the difference between sexual assault and sex trafficking? Sexual assault is any type of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the consent of the recipient. It includes sexual acts against people who are unable to consent, either due to age or lack of capacity. Sex trafficking means recruiting, harboring, transporting, patronizing, soliciting, obtaining, or providing a person to engage in a sex act in exchange for money or something of value. A victim of sex trafficking may also be a victim of sexual assault. Okay, let's go over some signs and indicators that might suggest that a person may be in a trafficking situation. It's important to understand that just because a person exhibits one or more of these actions doesn't automatically mean they're being trafficked. These are just one of many factors to consider. They avoid eye contact and interaction with others. They show signs of malnourishment, poor hygiene, fatigue, sleep deprivation, untreated illness, injuries, and/or unusual behavior. They often have no control over possessions, money, or identification. They may show signs of physical abuse, restraint, and/or confinement. They may exhibit evidence of verbal threats, psychological control, emotional abuse, and/or being treated in a demeaning way. They may lack the freedom of movement and are constantly monitored, often unable to speak for themselves. One of the pieces of data that I have come across over the past few weeks that has just really stuck with me and it jumped out at me when I read it is the correlation between social media and human trafficking. Human trafficking has been around. The correlation between the two have been around since social media was invented. Traffickers are innovative. They go where the people are. The people are on social media, that's where they go. But the increase in online recruitment since the pandemic is terrifying. Online recruitment increased by 22% in 2020. During the COVID-19 lockdown, recruitment sites like strip clubs, foster homes, and schools went down, but the internet became the top recruitment location for all forms of trafficking. Facebook and Instagram recruitment increased by an average of 120%. There was an 125% increase in reports of recruitment on Facebook over the previous year, and a 95% increase on Instagram. And just a few things to keep in mind, because social media is there. I'm on it multiple times a day. Most people I know are. These are a few things to keep in mind, especially if you have children. Traffickers will use and do use any social media platform to recruit. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat. I'm not very familiar with WhatsApp, or I'm not even sure if that's what it's called. I think it's called WhatsApp. It's a chat app. I've never used it, but apparently it is very big in recruitment. Traffickers will often develop personal or romantic relationships with the victims, and they'll often lure them with the promise of a better life and or money. An important thing to know when talking about human trafficking prevention and awareness is how to identify those who are most vulnerable. Just as anyone can be the victim of any kind of crime, anyone can experience trafficking, and trafficking can be experienced in any community. And while it can happen to anyone, evidence from the National Human Trafficking Hotline suggests that people of color and those within the LGBTQ plus communities are more likely to experience trafficking than any other demographic group. Generational trauma, historic oppression, discrimination, and other societal factors create community-wide vulnerabilities. Traffickers recognize and take advantage of people who are vulnerable. People who may be vulnerable to trafficking if they have an unstable living condition like homelessness or a transient living situation, previously experienced other forms of violence such as sexual abuse or domestic violence, have run away or are involved in the juvenile justice system or child welfare system, are undocumented immigrants, are facing poverty, have a caregiver or close family member who has a substance abuse issue, or if they themselves are addicted to drugs or alcohol. Another important question to ask is, what tactics do these traffickers use? How do they lure people in? These are just a few examples that we can pull from. A would-be employer refuses to give workers a signed contract or asks them to sign a contract in a language they can't read. A would-be employer collects fees from a potential worker for the opportunity to work in a particular job. The individual is newly showered with gifts or money, or becomes involved in an overwhelming, fast-moving, or asymmetric romantic relationship. The individual is a frequent runaway, or maybe staying with someone who is not their parent or guardian. The individual is developing a relationship that seems too close with someone they know solely on social media. There are obvious signs of abuse. The individual receives a too good to be true job opportunity. And the individual is recruited for an opportunity that requires them to move far away, but the recruiter avoids answering any questions or is reluctant to provide any details about the new job. Okay, so I know it's a heavy topic to talk about. And I know I flooded you guys with a whole lot of information, and I really thought that this would last a little longer. We've only been doing this about 20 minutes, so I went through it super fast. But now I want you to ask yourself, as an individual or as a small group, what can you do to make a stand against human trafficking? The short answer is get involved. How do you do that? Here are just a few ideas to get you guys started. Host an educational or fundraising event. Educate, promote, discuss, and empower participants to recognize the signs of human trafficking and take action. Share our social media posts. We post a lot on our social media pages. Emails are going out several times a week Share articles, share blog posts, or create your own. Share with your circle of influence and your community. Act on what you've learned. Volunteer. We have lots of volunteer opportunities with Grace. Start a Grace Ambassador program in your community. Team up with us to educate others about human trafficking. We have lots of ideas, lots of ways to get you guys involved and grow awareness. We have several webinars planned, and when I say planned, I mean in brainstorming phases. I've listed a few topics here that I currently have on the docket. There are no dates set for these yet, so be sure to keep an eye out for emails or posts about upcoming events. But these are just a few of the topics that we are looking at covering. And while you guys are looking at that, are there any questions? I'm going to just look and make sure that I haven't missed anything here. It doesn't look like I have. Any questions before we wrap up? I know that was super fast. I'll give you guys just a few minutes or a minute or so to ask any questions that you may have. All right, just a final thought to leave you guys with as we conclude. Prevention starts with awareness. I read a quote a few years ago that said, it was talking about awareness in general of any type of situation. Let's see, sorry, there's a question. This was great information. Will future webinars be at the same time? I actually am thinking about doing them at multiple times, maybe doing one during the week like this, but then maybe having one during an evening sometime, like later after people are home from work, or even over a weekend, like on a Saturday, just to see if we can get some more participation that way. I'm really excited that we had the interest in this webinar, especially with it being our very first one. We had 16 people register, which is awesome. And so I'm hoping that if we offer these at various times, that that we'll be able to reach more people. Yes, so many people have never heard this information. You're right. And if we were not in the business that we're in, I wouldn't know this information. So it's very important. And I'll just share this with you guys. Some of you know this story already. So I live in a small town in Southeast Georgia, and I did a very basic human trafficking awareness breakaway session at one of the local churches, Disciple Now events last summer. And I had a whole group I had the youth group all together, and then we actually split up where I just had the girls, and we talked about human trafficking. We talked about things to look out for when we're meeting new people. We talked about social media and how to be safe. We talked about red flags to look for if any of our friends start portraying certain behaviors. And a few months later, I got a call from the pastor of the church, and they had a situation with a girl that had started attending their youth. And there were some definite red flags and definite signs. He and the youth director would not have known or did not know what to look out for until we went over this with their group. So that's actually why I decided to start doing these webinars, because it made me realize that not everybody knows the things that I know. Sometimes we just take for granted that everybody knows what we know, but that's not always the case. So prevention starts with awareness. I read a quote a few years ago that it said, how can we fix a problem if we don't know about the problem? And that's really just kind of stuck with me. So thank you guys for joining in today. Everyone who registered will get a copy of the recording of the webinar, and keep an eye on your inbox for upcoming webinars, upcoming events. As always, if you guys have any questions about anything, please reach out to me. You all should have my email address from the webinar reminders. I'm going to put it right here, just so you guys have it if you need it here. All right, any other questions before we wrap up? All right, well, thank you guys so much. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and thanks for hanging out with me this afternoon.